Thanks, Professor Reagan. So around 8 months ago, the Competition Bureau assigned us a question. Should Canada retain dairy supply management for the long term? Today, we've come with an answer. Over the long term, we believe that dairy supply management should be progressively reformed, introducing the principles of competition in order to achieve the system's original objectives, those being ensuring a fair return to farmers and ensuring milk is accessible to all Canadians regardless of income. But before we get into advocating for our recommendations and our thesis, what is dairy supply management? Dairy supply management was an agricultural policy framework established in 1972, designed to ensure a predictable and stable income for farmers despite volatile macroeconomic circumstances. It was implemented and overseen by the Canadian Dairy Commission as it is today, which is a Crown corporation. Dairy supply management hinges on 3 key pillars. I want you to think of it a little bit like a 3-legged stool. Without one of the legs, the whole stool falls apart. This includes pricing, quota, and tariffs. First, for pricing, farmers do not sell their milk directly to processors or retailers. When you go to the grocery store, the milk you're buying isn't straight from the farmer. Rather, the milk is sold directly to what are called provincial marketing boards. These provincial marketing boards essentially guarantee a minimum price on an annual basis to all farmers, regardless of province. One price is set. This price is set in coordination between the Provincial Marketing Board and the Canadian Dairy Commission on a yearly basis. Next, you have quota. Quota can be understood 2 ways. First, at the macro level, and second, at the micro level. At the macro level, it can be understood as a total production limit for milk in Canada. So there's only a certain amount of milk that can be produced per month that the CDC sets. Essentially, the CDC allocates this total production per month to 2 main regions. The Western Milk Pool, which includes all provinces west of Ontario, and the P5, which includes Ontario, Quebec, and all eastern provinces except for Newfoundland. So a total allotment of milk production is separated between these 2 regions on a monthly basis. Then the milk quota is assigned to provincial marketing boards who then distribute it amongst farmers. Farmers can buy and sell quota, and this is where the micro component is important. Quota is essentially at the micro level for farmers a license to produce. So effectively, you need to hold a license in order to produce any sort of milk. There's a really important relationship I want you to remember between quota and pricing. That the guaranteed minimum price, as I said at the beginning of the year that is set, is adjusted, quota is adjusted based off this minimum price on a monthly basis. Sometimes demand for milk might be high and therefore more quota needs to be issued in order to maintain this annual price, and sometimes demand might be low, so less quota needs to be issued to maintain this price. Finally, we have tariffs. Tariffs are essentially additional taxes on any imports coming into Canada in excess of what is already designated for imports. So once it passes a certain threshold, milk is subject or dairy is subject to 200 to 300% taxes. These 3 pillars comprise dairy supply management and support its overall objective, ensuring a fair return for producers, but also ensuring access to high-quality milk for all Canadians. But this objective isn't really being reached. There are multiple failures and there are real costs with dairy supply management, and there are 4 striking facts that I want to draw your attention to. The first, between 2000 to 2017, it is estimated by the OECD, dairy supply management has costed Canadians over $46 billion, a huge amount. The second fact, around 93% of farms have declined since 1972 when the actual dairy supply management was established. Despite getting guaranteed prices, dairy farms are leaving the industry, or it's difficult for many dairies to enter the industry, and it's continuing to decline. Third, in 2021, the government rolled out a 6-year compensation plan to compensate farmers for any market share loss from foreign competitors, over $1.75 billion. Now, for the last fact, raise your hand if you consume dairy, any sort of dairy. Did you know on an annual basis, you're paying an additional $400 because, on average, as a result of dairy supply management? This is particularly marked for low-income Canadians. In a University of Toronto report, it is estimated that over 189,000 people in 2011 were pushed under the poverty line as a result of the additional costs of dairy supply management. This is particularly marked for families or low-income families with children. Now, in terms of looking a bit at our approach, it was natural for us to look at dairy supply management through a competition lens, given that our sponsor was the Competition Bureau. We wanted to specifically look at it through how competition was being affected in the industry, but also using it as a conduit for our recommendations. So looking at a really cool tool by the Competition Bureau that is used to assess the competition within various markets and industries is known as the Competition Assessment Toolkit. They use this in a multitude of circumstances. We wanted to leverage this tool and apply it to dairy supply management. Specifically, this tool comprises of 3 key criteria. Barriers to entry, which refers to the ability for firms to enter and expand within a given industry. Competitive parameters, the ability for firms to set the price, quality, and quantity of their products. And incentives to compete, the incentives for firms to vigorously compete within a given industry. We found a couple months ago that dairy supply management is failing along these criteria. For barriers to entry, quota prices are so high that many farmers can't enter dairying. For competitive parameters, with a certain amount of quota and a guaranteed price, farms can't determine the amount of milk they produce or how they price their milk. For competitive incentives with a guaranteed minimum price, there really is an incentive to drive down the cost of production. These ultimately lead to an unfulfilled mandate. Farmers are not receiving a fair return, some receiving returns way more than what they should deserve in a competitive market, and some much less. But it's also impacting the Canadians' ability to access high-quality dairy. Now, moving into our policy recommendations, we really wanted to leverage the mandate of the Competition Bureau to enforce and advocate for competition in Canada. Specifically, we wanted to focus on this advocacy piece in order to achieve our objective of ensuring that dairy supply management, once again, can ensure a fair return to farmers and access to quality milk. Our recommendations follows 3 key pillars: transparency, accountability, and governance, pricing, and quota. Transparency, accountability, and governance really focuses on building public pressure because, as Professor Reagan said, politics wants to keep dairy supply management in place. It's about creating reforms and public pressure in order to allow our more substantive reforms on pricing and quota. Jimmy and Jack will really expand on some innovative ways to really introduce competition through these other 2 segments. Now I'll be handing it off to Anna to talk about our first pillar.
So our first pillar contains 3 recommendations that really put the focus on transparency, accountability, and good governance, really looking through the lens of competition and putting the emphasis on building public awareness. So first recommendation is the establishment of a retail milk pricing index. As it currently stands, Canada does not have a single authoritative tool that measures the differences between milk prices across provinces in Canada as well as across different countries. So Canadians do not know what the different prices that they're paying for dairy products between different provinces, as well as comparing to countries that do not have a dairy supply management. In fact, surveys shows that less than 10% of Canadians even know what dairy supply management is and how it works, so they certainly cannot make that connection of how it affects their daily lives financially. So really putting the emphasis in this recommendation on building that public awareness and establishing the retail milk pricing index. We recommend that Competition Bureau advocate for that Statistics Canada establish this retail milk pricing index. And allow us to understand the pricing gaps both interprovincially and internationally within the dairy supply management. The Statistics Canada has the right tools and experience to establish this retail price index, and they can use the Food and Agriculture Organization Price Index, specifically the Dairy Price Index that measures the price differences and fluctuations internationally, especially in this dairy product basket that includes milk, butter, and others, as a model. Our goal in this recommendation is double. First, we want to increase public awareness. In turn, we want to increase public pressure that eventually elicit progressive changes within the dairy supply management. Second, we want to use this index as a benchmark tool that will allow us to measure the successes of the implementations of the recommendations that we will present to you during this presentation. Second, our recommendation is to optimize the COP, which is a cost of production survey, and its accessibility to the public. The cost of production survey is a survey that is conducted annually and measures the costs associated with producing 100 liters of milk. Jack will explain further how this cost of production survey has to do with setting price of the milk in his pillar on pricing. The results of cost of production survey are released annually by the CDC, along with the report on the process of COP surveying and milk pricing at the farm level. Yet, the data of the COP survey is only nationally representative and cannot be broken down into regional cost of production. So we don't know or don't understand the reasons why cost of production is different provincially. For example, we don't know why cost of production would be different in Alberta versus Quebec, for example. And the reason for that is because sample sizes are too small in smaller provinces, and we would need a larger sample size to have regional validity. So we recommend that Competition Bureau advocate that the COP survey would have larger sample sizes as well as a larger range of size farms. And also we recommend that COP survey would have their responses, individual responses of the COP survey be accessible to the public via online format, and that they would have more specific parameters such as farms per area or agricultural expenses in order the COP survey to be more transparent to the public. Now, the COP survey has been established a while ago, and during those years, the farm sizes, the sample sizes have been increasing. So there is precedent to this. But this model needs to be improved and more targeted for provinces that lack representation. And also we need to work on the transparency and accessibility of the public on the platform online. This goal and benefits of this implementation is to give consumers and stakeholders in the industry, such as think tanks, economists, academics, the accessibility for statistically significant information and data to allow them to use this information to provide to key players in the industry that they will be able to use to implement evidence-based policy decisions that will result in a more competitive industry. Lastly, for our third recommendation in this first pillar, we recommend to expand the CDC board. As it stands today, the few of the many responsibilities that they have is setting the Canadians' dairy policies, both provincially and federally, as well as allocating or making the decisions about allocation of dairy quota. And the CDC board is only comprised of 3 people, a CEO, a chairperson, and a commissioner. For example, the CRTC leadership has more than 10 people in their boards and leaderships. And in this reports and this team's opinion that the size of the CDC is limited, and this hampers their ability to fulfill their responsibilities in an efficient manner, and it raises concern about their ability to take out the biases out there of decision-making processes. We recommend that Competition Bureau increase the size of the CDC board, as well as increase the diversity and representations of stakeholders that have interest of a more competitive system and industry, such as consumers, for example. And in the past, Competition Bureau have given advice on designing a more competitive open banking system, regulatory open banking system, and has given practical advice on how accreditation bodies can best support competition and innovation. So the benefits of this recommendation is that it will introduce greater accountability into the CDC board, as well as foster a more dynamic policymaking environment, and will bring competition into discussion within the CDC board and eventually into dairy supply management market and the dairy industry in a whole. For the pricing pillar, I'm giving out to the Jack.
Thank you so much, Anna. So, I'd like to discuss some of our recommendations on pricing. But before we begin, I'd like to have a brief discussion about pricing, and I'd like to mention 3 key points. The first is that the minimum guaranteed price, as Julian was discussing earlier, really takes into account 2 key factors. The first is farmers' cost of production, and the second is the Consumer Price Index, which is compiled and issued monthly by Statistics Canada. Now, the second key point is that the cost of production comes from a nationally representative survey of roughly 250 to 300 farms and calculates the average cost of producing 100 liters of milk on a farm in Canada. And third, and most critically, the cost of production survey is tilted in favor of high-cost producers, as these make up the majority of the sample size. Now, why is the CDC's cost formula an issue? Well, other than contributing to high minimum costs guaranteed by the CDC, as previously noted, it also leads to a lack of incentive for more high-cost producers to become more competitive, as they're able to cover the cost of their inputs, which leads them to have less of an incentive to adopt more cost-effective production mechanisms. Now, what we propose is that the Competition Bureau advocate to the CDC to adopt a new statistical formula that ties the cost of production to high-quality, low-cost producers, as would occur in a more competitive market. Now, there's some precedent for this recommendation. Most importantly, the Competition Bureau has advocated to the CRTC in its rate-setting methodologies, which in particular is setting the price of various telecommunications products in Canada. Now, the Competition Bureau's comments have really focused on ensuring that within regulated markets, such as telecommunications, that price-setting decisions match and reflect what would occur in a more competitive market, as this recommendation proposes that to be done. And further, our team sees 2 key benefits in this type of recommendation. The first is that it would lead to lower minimum prices or farm gate prices, and the second is that it would lead to lower barriers to entry. So on the issue of lower farm gate prices, as the cost of production will be driven by low-cost producers, this will ensure that this price declines, which will generate savings for processors who purchase the milk from farmers. Then processors can pass these savings on to retailers that can then pass these savings on to consumers. And the second is that lower barriers to entry. So as Julian was discussing a little bit earlier, there's a clear connection between the cost cost guaranteed by the CDC and the amount of quota that is allocated. So as the minimum guaranteed price declines, the CDC will be able to issue more quota, which will lessen its cost and allow more farmers to enter the industry and more incumbent farmers to expand their operations. Now, to visualize what this recommendation would look like, on the left is how the cost of production survey sample currently looks, and as you can see, it calculates the cost of production amongst both high and low cost producers, as well as farms that produce a varying quality of milk, both high and low cost. Now, on the right is you see what our recommendation aims to do. So as you can see in green, the majority of the cost of production sample size will be made up of high quality, low cost producers, rather than, and this will be sure to ensure that the average cost of production is taken from amongst these producers in particular. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit about retail prices. So currently in Canada, traditional dairy products, so milk, cheese, ice cream, is exempt from GST, as these products are considered basic grocery products by the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency. However, these products' closest competitors, plant-based alternatives, are currently not exempt from GST, as they are not considered basic grocery products. Now, this puts traditional grocery products at more of an advantage, and it lessens their incentive to become more cost competitive in order to compete on a level playing field with plant-based products. Now, what we recommend is that the Competition Bureau advocate to the Department of Finance Canada and to the CRA to ensure that all plant-based dairy alternatives are exempt from GST. Now, there's some advocacy on this type of recommendation. In particular, the Competition Bureau has noted that the structure of certain excise taxes, such as GST, can really harm the competitiveness of small and medium-sized enterprises that are looking to enter and expand markets, particularly those such as the producers of plant-based alternatives. Now, there are 2 primary benefits for this type of recommendation. The first is that it will put more competitive pressure on traditional dairy products by forcing them to compete on a level playing field with plant-based products. And the second is that it will lower grocery prices. By ensuring that these products are exempt from GST, this will lower the cost of plant-based alternatives, which will disproportionately benefit low-income consumers as they spend a larger portion of their income on these products. And as Julian has discussed, ensuring that low-income Canadians can access these products is one of our key policy goals. Now I'd like to pass it over to Jimmy to discuss some of our recommendations on quota.
Thank you, Jack. Currently, farms access quota in provincial exchanges. Provincial exchanges act like auctions,
So farms will auction or bid for access to new quota. Whatever farm has the highest bid gets the quota. In this graph, we can see the difference in prices of quota in each of the exchanges in Canada. And one striking fact is clear, is that quota license, or the license of producing 1 kilogram of butter fat a day, is not cheap. In the P5, so in eastern provinces in red, we can see that the price of one license can cost up to $24,000. Whereas in the west side in Canada, in provinces like Alberta, it can go to more than $50,000 a license. The reason why this is the case is because there is little quota available in the exchange markets, but there is a lot of demand available as well. One key aspect to remember in all of this is that when dairy supply management was created in 1972, quota was given for free to farmers. Now, this creates a couple of problems for competition. The first one, for competitive parameters, farms cannot establish the quantity of milk that they want to produce. Second, it is a barrier of entry for new entrants that want to enter into the market and that find the price of quota too high to enter. And lastly, for current farms that want to expand their operations and reach scalability, the price of quota is too high to achieve it. Now, what we propose is the creation of a national quota auction. And there are two innovations that we're going to be introducing into this national quota auction. The first one is that farms will be prioritized not only in their ability to pay for quota, but also in their productivity, in their cost of production, as well as in the history of producing high quality milk. The second innovation is that part of the quota allocated in this national auction will be given access to new entrants into the market where they're going to be able to compete in a more playing level field. Now, there are two cases of studies that we use to come up with this recommendation. The first one is that currently, the way that the exchange markets work creates a precedent for us to create this system and enhance the current system that already exists and expand it. And the second one, we borrow inspiration from ISET, who use a national quota auction to auction of broadband spectrum for telecommunications companies. This was done, I believe, in 2014. And one key aspect of this approach was that a portion of broadband spectrum was given to, or at least one recommendation was given to new entrants or new telecommunications company that wanted to enter into the market here in Canada. Now we see three benefits out of this recommendation. The first one is that we will increase accessibility of low quota costs for farms that want to access the market. Second is that we will generate revenue that will help us finance some of these recommendations. And lastly, that will lower the barrier of entry, particularly for new entrants that want to enter into the market. Another issue that we found during our research is that once those licenses are allocated in each of the provinces, that license cannot be moved to other provinces. So let's say I'm a farm in New Brunswick and I want to sell my license. I can only sell the license provincially. I cannot sell it to a farm in PEI or Nova Scotia or Ontario. And this creates a problem for competition, and it's that low-cost regions or farms in low-cost regions in Canada cannot access a greater amount of quota, ultimately creating prices too high for consumers at the retail. So what we propose is the progressive removal of interprovincial trade of quota, first within regional boundaries, so the P5, so the Eastern Canada, and the Western Milk Pool in the west of Canada, and then unifying both regions nationally so quota can be moved effectively anywhere between Canada. Now we have two case studies to validate this recommendation. First one, there is precedent in 1996, Ontario and Quebec were able to actually freely trade quota or licenses between the two provinces. And second, in Australia, once they eliminated their dairy supply management in the early 2000s, we saw the benefits of quota or production of milk moving from high-cost areas to low-cost areas, which ultimately benefited the Australian economy, and they were able to actually export dairy products to other markets in the world. So yeah, the benefits are two, mainly to reduce barriers of entry by allowing access to farms to a greater amount or greater pool of quota. And lastly, for them to achieve economies of scale, which ultimately will benefit the consumer at the retail with lower prices of milk. Another point that Julian was mentioning at the beginning is that Canada currently have very low tariff rate quotas. So anything about that limit of quota that is allocated by the government is taxed at a really high amount. So what we propose here is to progressively increase that selectively increase the access of certain products that are not made in Canada. This policy ultimately was designed to protect dairy farmers from losses in market share. And what we want to do is to identify products that are currently not made in Canada to give them more access into the markets for consumers to have a greater access to a larger variety of products. And we have identified two products. The first one is the protected destination of origin and the protected geographic indication products with this certification. These are the Parmesan, the authentic Parmesan cheese that is made in Italy, or the Gouda cheese that is made in Holland, right? These are products, because they have this certification, cannot be made in Canada. So we see the benefits or the case studies that led us to come up with this recommendation. So the first one is the Australian dairy trade liberalization. After the 2000s, we saw a rapid decline in the prices of milk post the regularization of the dairy supply management. And lastly, we saw that in Canada, historically, particularly in the early 2000s and more recently in 2018 with the signature of the new NAFTA agreement, the structural change on import restrictions that Canada was willing to make. So essentially, this policy will help Canada to show willingness to their trading partners that they're willing to make changes for them to be able to access or to get more access to products here in Canada. Now, the benefits are threefold. The first one is that we incentivize competition, particularly in the cheese sector here in Canada, by introducing these products that are mostly cheese. Second one is that we will provide broader access to selection of products to Canadian consumers at a lower price. And lastly, although we want to do this, we want to be selective, and we want to be selective because we don't want milk from other parts of Canada to flow and literally destroy the dairy sector, right? Because that will effectively happen. We want to be selective in which products can come into the market that will allow markets to be more competitive while giving more cost-effective solutions to Canadians.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit about our implementation strategy. And I'd like to note 3 key points. So the first is that this implementation strategy is meant to encompass both the Competition Bureau's advocacy efforts, as well as the implementation timelines for the stakeholders who have been mentioned in our recommendations. The second point, as I'd like to note, is that this is meant to be a 15-year progressive plan that occurs over primarily 2 phases. The first being in the short term, 0 to 5 years, and the second being in the longer term, between 5 to 15. And the third point is that these recommendations are not meant to be contingent on one another, and are meant to be independent so they can be implemented independently of one another. So first, I'd like to direct your attention to some of the funding mechanisms. So aside from the first 2 funding mechanisms that we've identified, which involve reallocating the operating budgets of the CDC and Statistics Canada to ensure that these organizations can engage in data collection, as well as reallocating raising the administrative fees for provincial marketing boards, we really have 2 robust funding mechanisms that we'd like to draw your attention to. The first of those is to reallocate the current dairy subsidies to fund some of these recommendations. Now, currently, these dairy subsidies are slated to cost $1.75 billion over the next 6 years. And the second is to allocate some of the funds that were generated through the quota auction that Jimmy was discussing earlier that could be used to fund some of our recommendations. Now, looking at the first series of recommendations between 0 to 5 years, these recommendations are really designed to do 2 things. The first is that these recommendations really rely on pre-existing capacities within the Canadian government. And the second is that these recommendations are also noted because they're really designed to generate public pressure for reform, as was discussed a little bit earlier by Anna. And that these recommendations are designed to lay out a path that will allow some of our more substantial recommendations, as seen in the 5 to 15 years, touching on pricing and quota, will allow them to become more of a reality. Now I'd like to turn it over to Julian to conclude.
Thanks, Jack. So today we've told you a couple things. First, we've identified some of the main issues of competition within dairy supply management, those of barriers to entry, competitive parameters, as well as incentives to compete. Ultimately, we want to leverage the advocacy aspect of the Competition Bureau's mandate in advocating for our 8 recommendations. These range from creating public awareness and pressure to change the political tide on dairy in order to allow some of our reforms to take place, but to also increase public awareness about the costs of the system. Jack offers some really interesting ideas in terms of the CDC's pricing methodology and tying it to low-cost producers, while Jimmy really talks about reducing tariff rate quotas or tariff barriers, as well as other issues relating to quota transfer within Canada. Ultimately, this is for the goal of achieving a fair return premised on a competitive view for the dairy industry and ensuring access to high-quality dairy for all Canadians. Thank you for listening to our presentation. And we'd like to thank our sponsor and stakeholders we've engaged. Thank you.
Good work.
Is that moo?
This is
All
just
right,
way too
moo,
much
moo.
fun. So
Okay,
when
we
Natalie
want more
and
parmesan
Chris,
and Gouda.
when Natalie and Chris invited me to be part of this, or when I invited myself actually to be part of this jury, I think they both said to me, "Oh, and we're going to have some really good ones, like we're doing supply management on dairy products." And I can see why now. You've actually taken a really complicated issue and explained it all to us, including some of the detail, and mapped out something that actually makes it sound possible or plausible. That said, we've been we've been talking about this issue for 20, 30, 40 years, I guess. And part of public policy is having a really good idea, and a logical plan and an implementation that works. And part of it is just finding the right time to kind of lob it out there. So that's the obvious question here. Like, why now? What's different? Why do you think this is a time when what has been a politically hot potato this might actually be a good time to launch into that discussion and try and make it happen?
I can take that. No, that's an excellent question, and I think that was one of the first questions that we asked to the Competition Bureau when we met back in November. Why are you asking this question now? And I think the main answer I want everyone to take away is that lower income Canadians, or Canadians in general, are right now being hurt because of inflation. And inflation right now is pinching on people's pockets in their ability to pay their bills. And the Competition Bureau has been looking at, okay, what are the sources of that inflation right here in Canada? We saw, for example, the Competition Bureau launching that market investigation, right, to really see at the retail level, is that price increase coming from there, right? And this, I believe, is an expansion of that. What sources of legitimately legislation here in Canada are actually causing inflation? And dairy supply management is perhaps one of those. Those questions, or one of those sources of mechanisms, right, of policy that is, as we saw, affecting 189,000 Canadians, as at least in 2011, according to that University of Toronto report. So I think the context is the world that we're living right now of high inflation, and particularly of food groceries, causes of and how that is impacting low-income Canadians and Canadians in general.
Thank you. Excellent work, and I agree, an excellent presentation and coverage. I was kind of going in the same place of going, where's the resistance? But you make a very good point about inflation and a focus on food prices, which creates opportunity in terms of timing. So it's a very timely discussion. But I guess turning to the Competition Bureau's role itself, you've pointed out that it has an advocacy function, and it uses it. It uses it in telecommunications, broadcasting, new transportation, banking. It's exercised it in numerous areas. But fundamentally, this isn't their legislation. It isn't their responsibility. So my question to you is, how do you get Agriculture Canada? How do you get the ministers with direct responsibility to listen to that advocacy?
I can go if you'd like me to. Thank you for that question, and it's an absolutely excellent question. It's something that we've certainly discussed. So I think I'd raise 2 points. The first is that the Competition Bureau, as you noted, is really an advocacy organization, and that's really its focus, is to ensure that the public is aware of the context surrounding DSM, and particularly some of its impacts on competition, and some of its other impacts, particularly on low-income Canadians. And the second is that, as I think Anna has pointed out, is that really the focus is on ingraining public support. And a lot of this, I think, can't be done without that type of public support and public conversation. So to answer the question, I think, of really focusing on how can we get ministers on board, how can we get the legislative piece on board, which is absolutely critical, I think really comes down to the public. I think that having a public understanding, fewer than 10% of Canadians understand DSM, having the public on board, knocking at MPs' doors, of going to these meetings and showing up saying that this is a problem and this is affecting me and my family and that this is a real concern around the dinner table every night. I think that type of advocacy is really going to get this type of these types of recommendations really through the door and into more of the mainstream policy discourse that's occurring in Ottawa.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I just when I read your policy brief, you spoke a bit about lobbying, and it was absent from this presentation. But I'm very curious, how would you counter a group like the Dairy Farmers of Canada, which is an extremely powerful lobbying group? When you speak about the Competition Bureau, sure, they have an advocacy arm, but the Dairy Farmers of Canada can hire 3 or 4 firms, have commercials running every single day, pull up billboard ads about why they're so important. So just curious how you create this environment where it'd be favorable for a political operative or a political party to move forward on this kind of policy when the dairy farmers can create a very negative environment and there's really not much votes to gain in moving forward on something like this.
Actually, a great question. It will be maybe a little bit repetitive to what Jack answered, but we had the discussions literally yesterday, and I was jokingly saying, should we do a anti-cow campaign? But no, this is our answer to this was the retail milk price index, because this is our way to really educate the public and show them how much they're paying, and this is how we recruit the public support and elicit those changes within Parliament Hill, push those changes within the dairy supply management. The public is our force into changing dairy supply management, both against the lobbying, which you correctly stated that they're a strong force. They got a strong hold on the Parliament. They spend about $100 million per year on lobbying within Parliament. So honestly, the one answer is the public. We are big in numbers, we are strong when we are united, but we need to know first what we're tackling. And the fact that less than 10% of Canadians know what dairy supply management is, how it works, and how it affects them on a daily basis is the problem. And by solving that first, letting them know how much they're paying and how it affects them, this is how we recruit that anti-power. And not by campaigning against cows, because they did nothing wrong to us. So,
if I might add, just onto that question, our plan wasn't really about this idea of us versus them, or we're coming to disrupt the system. Many farmers themselves are not receiving returns that they should be receiving. There are many farms who want to expand, who are part of DFC, that are not really wanting to change the system, and these farmers are losing out as well. In Australia, as an example, the farmers themselves were the ones who advocated for system change. And what our plan really does, in addition to what Anna is really focusing on in terms of building public awareness, is also showing farmers who could be receiving a better return the prospect of that being a reality. And I think that buy-in and getting that buy-in from those types of farmers is critical here. We don't want to push this us versus them narrative. And I think sometimes dairy lobby kind of tries to portray this in terms of the NAFTA renegotiations, et cetera. Our plan tries to kind of counter this issue, building on what Anna said, by also, focusing on farmers that are not receiving a fair return as well.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie from the sponsor is in the room or online? Online. Okay, Stephanie, and then the coach, Luc Vallée, may have a question. Take it away, Stephanie.
Hi, team. Congratulations. Great presentation today. Just wanted to say that at the outset. I don't have any specific questions for you. I am sure some of the members of my team over here at the Bureau will, but just wanted to congratulate you on a job well done. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you over the last 6 months. And we look forward to diving deep into these recommendations and seeing what we might be able to do in the area. I'm going to turn it over, though, now to my manager, Brad Callahan, who'd like to say a few words as well.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me there in the room. Just to echo Stephanie, I just wanted to say what a pleasure it was to work with everybody from the team that took on this study. I'm the Associate Deputy Commissioner at the Competition Bureau and am essentially in charge of our advocacy program. I work with Stephanie as well as Ryan Jakubowski, who may follow up with a question for the team. But this has been fantastic to work with the team. Obviously, this is an issue that we think about. It's an area where there's obviously a question about the role of competition. And I think what the team has done is really put a lot of thought and a lot more detail into potential solutions. They've given us a lot to think about. I'm not on to make any pronouncements about maybe what the next steps will be for the Bureau, but you've really advanced the discussion for us and have given us a great proposal on things to think about for potential advocacy for the future in an area that is obviously so important for Canadians. So well done to everybody on the team, and thanks for all of your work on the project and what you've done to advance the discussion on competition in Canada. Maybe I can turn it to Ryan Jakubowski, who's our major case director in our advocacy group. Maybe for a question.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start by repeating what Stephanie and Brad had to say. I thought it was a terrific job, and I found it very interesting reading the report and then also listening to the presentation today. I think just a lot of different ideas and a lot of unexpected ideas. So that was, like I said, very, very interesting. One thing I wanted to ask about is, I think all of the kind of possible reforms that you set out, it's really reforming the dairy supply management system as it is. And I can see how that's maybe the most realistic goal, but I was curious if you, as a team, considered policy alternatives to quotas. A lot of countries support the domestic dairy industry with subsidies, for example. And if you did, maybe you could talk a little bit about why you focused on sort of reforming the system we have as opposed to thinking of kind of creating a new system overall.
Yeah, I think I could take that, Ryan. Thanks for that question. I think there's a couple of reasons why we did that. The first one is the political inertia, that is to keep the system as it is. The second one is that the system is extremely expensive. So the value of quota right now of those licenses varies around $30 to $60 billion. And the debt tied to that license, because farmers use that license as a collateral to, improve their farms or buy new equipment, is over $100 billion. So if we were to remove that system altogether, we will see, for example, the collapse of farms, of Farm Credit Canada, which currently has a portfolio of around $7 billion, just particularly in the dairy sector, and other financial institutions in the country. So this is a huge issue that, I could see your faces. This is way bigger than what we can imagine, right? So for us, the priority was to how can we progressively improve the system that we have, introducing more competition rather than building an entire system altogether, knowing the cost and the political inertia.
Thanks. That kind of relates to a second question I had. In some sense, it kind of reminds me of the taxi medallions, being very expensive. And then when Uber kind of came along, that was a big impact. I'm guessing, in your view, it's by spreading it out over the 15 years, you're thinking that'll make it a kind of a gradual thing. But I wondered if there's anything more to kind of say on that, or if that's right.
Hi. Yes, that was the idea. So we did want to have a more progressive system because we recognized, I think, as you rightly pointed out, and as Jimmy mentioned, that one of our concerns was having, an immediate collapse and the type of calamity that would cause, particularly within Canada, and also the potential competition ramifications of that collapse of, having suddenly farms being, for sale and seeing like very rapid consolidation was also very much a concern. And so given the fact that quota has become such an overcapitalized and overvalued asset, the hope was that over the 15 years and over a longer time scale, that to use perhaps a metaphor of letting the air out of the balloon, of kind of slowly reforming so that the system doesn't collapse all at once and we aren't left with a crisis on our hands.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Luke, Coach Luke Valet.
Yeah, I was going to ask the question about, what if you had the political buy-in? Would you go faster? And the answer is no. It's still, all the steps are needed. Not only you need to have the political buy-in, which is the first step, but then you still need to take your time because the system is heavily capitalized on the values of these quotas. Well, I'm going to ask another question, which is somehow related to this economies of scale that you said. Well, farmers can't reach the economies of scale that they wish that they had in achieving the scale that would be necessary to make the price of milk more competitive. But at the same time, there must have been economies of scale since the number of farms has decreased, probably by 50% every decade for 50 years, bringing it down to, I don't know if it was 93% or 97%, but a huge amount of farms disappeared. And so don't we have economies of scale already? When that many farms disappear, you get the access to larger farms, don't you?
So yes, that's a fair point. However, the average herd size in Canada as of 2014 is 70 cows. 70. In comparison, the U.S. average herd size is around 200. So even though we have seen a decline in the number of farms since 1972, the average herd size is still too small to reach that economics of scale. And particularly, maybe the reason why is, as we have identified during the meeting, during this session, is there's really no incentive to compete, to increase, and so on. And even though there has been some consolidation happening between farms, right? When you compare it to consolidations in other jurisdictions, particularly the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, that has been way slower in Canada than in the U.S. and other jurisdictions, which ultimately limits, right? Or the DSM, dairy supply management, is limiting that capacity of the current system in Canada to scale and reach economics of scale, which ultimately will result in lower prices for consumers.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. So I've got Simon, Asma, Veronique, and Abby in that order. Simon. Oh, okay, hold on. Okay, Simon, okay, I got it. So Simon's
okay.
first.
All right, hello. So you mentioned the problems with failing to achieve economies of scale, increasing production so that the amount of milk that is producing is kept to a certain level to keep prices high. My question would be, if we were to do your recommendations, how would you prevent the opposite from happening, which is that production gets far too high, which causes the price to collapse, which will also prevent a return on investment? What's your plan to prevent that from happening?
Sure. I feel like I'm in micro. Jeez. Yeah, so I think, to answer your question, I think that what we're trying to do is, still maintain quotas in place and ensure that, production more so flows to farms that want to expand their operation. It's not about producing too much, but rather keeping the system in place, but ensuring the allocation moves more efficiently. So your point about too much milk being produced and potentially, saturating the market, dairy supply management still exists. There's still allotment that goes on between the Canadian Dairy Commission as well as provincial marketing boards. But what we're trying to do is, within that allotment, the quotas flow to the regions that are the most productive, which is more competitive. In terms of, creating more milk, it doesn't really as much exist in our kind of scenario. And that's kind of why we've chosen to keep the system. So yeah, really reiterating that idea of the allocation existing, but kind of moving towards the most productive regions to allow the most efficient kind of producers to produce that milk within the given allotment.
Okay, Asma, then Veronique.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I can now hopefully say that I'm part of the 10% of Canadians that understand dairy supply management. My question regards one of your recommendation, and I think I just need a little bit more of clarification because I might have missed something. So how can you make sure that bigger players won't have an unfair advantage in a national quota auction and thus have create an oligopoly market where the prices would end up being higher actually than lower, as we often see in Canada?
I guess I'm answering all the questions. So in this case, there is a relationship. There are two points to remember. First one is the interprovincial trade of barriers of quota, right? That will be decline over time. So more access of quota will be available to a larger pool of farms. And the second one is the creation or the issuing of new quotas as a result of a lower price of milk as a result of the changes that Jack was talking about, because of the changes of composition of the COP plus CPI changes on price milk. So by issuing more quota, we will have a larger pool of quota, right, at a lower price that will give access to farms to be able to compete. Now, one thing that we want to remember is that consolidation in itself is not wrong. It's not bad. You can have actually good consolidation markets where ultimately will result in lower prices for consumers, right? So I think there's a difference that we need to draw there. I also think that there is a role for the Competition Bureau to play. For example, in the Australian case, in 2018, there was the creation of a dairy code of conduct that essentially regulated the relationship between producers and processors. And I think the Competition Bureau perhaps could analyze that occurrences in that auction, right, to make sure that quota is effectively allocated not only on farms that have low-cost production, but also on farms that have shown to have high productivity or high quality of milk, to make sure that quota is not going only to farms that have one allocation or one, let's say, higher capital costs or higher incomes, right, but also to farms that ultimately have higher productivity and quality of milk. So that's why we introduced those two innovations to the auction. So not only the ones that have the highest willingness to pay, right, or the highest income to pay more for more auction, but also that have shown that they can reduce costs and they can produce continuously milk prices at a high quality.
Okay, we have 8 minutes and 4 questions and presumably 4 answers. So they've got to be quick. Veronique, then Abigail, then Dan Weinstock, then Ben.
Thank you. My question is on recommendation number 1, and I have a bit of an introduction to it. So prices of milk differ from countries to countries. Reasons for that include like supply management, as you said, but also right to what cows eat and the quality of food that they eat. So you propose to produce a retail milk price index to create an increased public awareness. But how will you do that, or the Commission Bureau will do that, without propaging disinformation about the price of milk, and to make sure that not everyone only wants the cheaper milk available, but also milk of quality?
Well, first of all, I want to rebuttal the assumption that just because other countries have it cheaper, that their quality of feed for the cows or quality of milk is lower. Because, for example, New Zealand, Australia, we've spoken to stakeholders, their quality both of milk or feed is very high, and they're considered the most consolidated market in the world in dairy. Second, the detail in technicalities, I don't know them that much and also it would be very long to go into now, not in 8 minutes, that's for sure. But the purpose of the retail milk price index is more to give a picture, because the consumers, they won't go into that details anyway. They need to see the picture of how much they're paying, comparing like province to province, because that would be would raise the question of why my friend in Alberta is paying different than I am. We're in the same country. Or why in Alberta the prices change from month to month by twice the difference than in my province. It would raise awareness of these differences between Canada and other countries, and raise questions about the dairy supply management, and that is the goal. Because as again, I keep saying about the 10% of Canadians, that most Canadians do not know anything about dairy supply management, and yet they claim to support it, to support farmers at any cost. But it is a perception that is based on zero evidence. So our goal is not to go into the nitty-gritty and about the feed and all of that. Our goal is to raise awareness and for the public to ask questions, and inevitably we expect the public to put the pressure on dairy supply management and for change.
Can I just say that the mention of New Zealand is also the answer to Simon's question? So Simon, you don't have to worry about a surplus and drowning in milk. You can just export it. And New Zealand is now, I believe, the world's largest exporter in milk.
It is.
Okay. We are going to Abby, then Dan, then Ben.
Great. Thank you guys so much for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask a question about pricing and taxes. So you mentioned lifting taxes for dairy alternatives, and as someone who drinks a lot of dairy alternatives, that sounds great. But I'm wondering, how much will that cost, and what will that effect be on government budgets? Like, how much are we talking there?
So that's an absolutely excellent question. So
Plant. It was a planted question, I'm sure.
So the question of how much will it cost. So that's a really, really, really good question. Anyway, to answer, it's difficult to tell for a variety of reasons. The first being that, so just to start with the facts. So currently right now, the plant-based market here in Canada is worth roughly $450 million. And so likely eliminating GST will be a sizable, which is roughly 5%, will be a somewhat sizable amount of the federal budget. That part is true. What I would say, though, in terms of how to pay for it, which is really your second question, is that's why we advocated two of our more robust funding mechanisms. The first of those is to reallocate some of the spending of the $1.75 billion over the next 6 years on dairy subsidies, to reallocate that money to be able to cover the cost of eliminating GST and all plant-based alternatives, which will certainly be lower than $1.75 billion. And the second is that why we've also advocated for reallocating the potential revenues gained through the auction system, of allowing that money to flow from the new quota auction that Jimmy has proposed to be able to also cover any potential budget shortfall that arises from the elimination of GST on plant-based dairy alternatives.
I'm here. So that was really great, guys. You really milked it for everything it was worth. It was very Gouda. Chris mentioned at the very beginning when he was introducing you that dairy isn't the only area in which supply management is practiced. Did you talk at all about whether some of your conclusions generalized, or is there something specific or some things that are specific about the dairy industry in Canada that makes it the case that what might be a good idea here might not translate cleanly to, I don't know, maple syrup, for example, or other areas where we practice supply management? I mean, if the answer is no, then that's fine because it's outside the scope of the question, but I'd just be curious.
Thank you for the question. So just to preface, we didn't extensively look at any other kind of supply managed products like poultry or eggs, for example. But some of the kind of results, ring true with the fact that, low-income Canadians are being impacted by supply management across dairy, across poultry, or for eggs in Canada. And I think that, some of the recommendations around kind of like looking at alternatives or kind of a demand side recommendation with regards to eliminating GST, there can be other alternatives within the retail space for these other types of products that might serve as inspiration for those areas. But dairy supply management is, particularly contentious because, as one of the judges, mentioned, is because of the lobby, and it's really received, so much clout because of the lobby really putting it on television. The Toronto Maple Leafs jersey has milk, if you've seen it before. It's really a politically contentious issue, and that's why it's really getting a lot of the limelight. But I think a lot of our recommendations, at the end of the day, are quite interoperable with supply managed systems. in different industries, especially like the ones you mentioned, but also when we looked at other case studies engaging with stakeholders in Australia and New Zealand who kind of transitioned for dairy, their systems are not exactly the same. And in a way, eggs and other supply management goods are not exactly the same to dairy, but there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from these other industries, but also potential applications for our recommendations to, some of these other industries that could be explored. But as I said, we didn't, extensively explore it. But, who knows, maybe the Competition Bureau might sponsor next year's policy lab.
Okay. We are receptive to an offer. Ben gets the penultimate question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you another point? Oh, sorry. I'll get into it. Thanks so much for a great presentation. And supply management is a really complex policy framework to contend with, and that you guys were able to summarize it succinctly off the top was really appreciated to the audience. And I actually think many people in this room had the privilege of visiting a dairy farm in the last week, which was a life-changing experience. This question might go outside the scope of your policy lab. So if that's the case, that's totally fine. But I think coming from rural Canada, there's a preoccupation that a move to deregulate or change the dairy system and maybe have the consolidation of farms, fewer farms, larger farms, is going to somehow stratify the wealth of rural Canada in a place where there's already not very much economic opportunity. I know that lots of us in rural Canada look to the situation of the rural United States with not a lot of envy. And so I'm wondering if in your stakeholder consultations you spoke to any rural community groups, or maybe not necessarily dairy, but anyone who may share some of those preoccupations. Again, understanding that you're taking this from a competitive standpoint. So it may be a bit outside of the scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So I think your question had a couple of parts, so I'd like to address each in turn. If I miss one, please feel free to remind me of a couple. So in terms of the rural effect of these recommendations on rural Canada, something that we really found notable is that particularly in certain farms, there's a real concern about the fact that they can't expand, that they may be small operations currently, but they are interested in innovation. They want to expand their businesses, but they simply can't because of the high cost of quota. And as these recommendations are really focused on lowering those costs and lowering barriers to entry, this will potentially allow incumbent farmers to become larger farms and really bring up the wealth of rural Canada, and B, to allow individuals that might not have been interested in farming to access that industry and to become a larger part of that type of the fabric of rural Canada that you mentioned. Now, in terms of discussing with stakeholders, that is something we heard quite a bit of the impact of dairy supply management on rural Canada, and also kind of rural Canadian groups' interest in dairy supply management. And something I would say to that is there are really two key points. The first is that unfortunately, a lot of the smaller, kind of more family-driven farms are already exiting the industry. And it's clear that the policy approach that's been taken in Canada since 1972 really hasn't helped those farms as much as possible. And so we're offering an alternative. And the second, this is also really important, is that part of the reason that farms are also leaving is because not so much of dairy supply management or higher costs, but also simply an interest amongst a younger generation to move from rural settings into urban ones. And so another focus our recommendation is showing to rural people currently living in rural areas, or people that might be interested in moving to rural areas, that there is a way that they can enter the industry and become successful dairy farmers. And so that's something else we've really considered and something we've heard from stakeholders quite a bit.
If I may, I'd like to ask a question just to connect Ben's question to Shaq's comment. So you've laid out a vision which is ultimately, lower price quotas, therefore fewer barriers to entry. And the New Zealand model suggests we could actually become a much bigger, it's not an anti-cow policy, it's a pro-cow policy. We could end up with more cows, more milk, more dairy farms, and exports, which we don't currently do, okay? But Shaq's problem is, how do we get there? Because your policies, and I think part of the brilliance of your policies is that it is gradual, right? It's this sort of 15-year, bit by bit, dismantling, more or less, of the system. But that is going to reduce the value of the assets that are currently being held. So every single dairy farmer currently On average, they have 70 cows. The market value is $23,000 per cow. So that's $150,000, $1.5 million, sorry, in probably borrowed money. So if this policy is going to gently reduce the value of those quotas, which means it's gently going to generate capital losses for them. So of course, back to Shaq's point, wow, they're going to say, why do we like this idea? So my question is, why did you consider, and if not, why not, a simple policy, conceptually simple policy to ease the transition, which is buy them out. Buy them out. And it might be quite expensive for a few years, but the net present value of the infinite stream of lower prices to 37 million consumers has got to make that one a positive net present value. So, did you consider that?
Yeah, we consider that. I mean, the quick answer is that the government will have to pay around $60 billion. 60. Yeah. So that's a lot of money that currently.
So it's 2.8% of GDP over 15 years.
No, if we want to buy it now, like if we want to buy the quota now, it will be I'll give you an example of what Australia did. So Australia bought all the quota from all the farms. They bought it for $1.7 billion. The way that they financed it was that they exercised a tax on the liter of milk of few cents for like 4 or 5 years. Now for Canada, if we weren't, how we're gonna pay that let's say $40-60 billion, depending on that value, it will be a lot of money for Canada to be expending, knowing that Canadians are already paying a lot for milk, knowing that Canada is already subsidizing milk, right, at $1.7 billion for the next 4 or 5 years. So for us was an answer of who's going to pay for this? Is it going to be the Canadian consumer that is currently pushing, or the system that is currently pushing 189,000 people below the poverty line, or are we going to let the market decide which price should farms pay for quota and exchange based on farms that should leave the market because they're already paying, or they cannot be affordable, or farms that actually can access more quota that could expand. So for us, the fair approach was to leave it to a market to decide which price should Canadian farms access that quota, and thus during the next 5-15 years, let that market fly float to the point that it's competitive, and us not paying those $50 or $40, $60 billion, right, that ultimately will.
So
benefit.
isn't it the case, though, that without some sort of buyout, that they're going to hire Shaq Chambers as a first-rate lobbyist, and they're just going to shut this down?
I don't know. What? What?
Because he's that good. He's that good.
Well, we're going to have to come up with a campaign of our own then. But also I wanted to mention that in Australia, did you say, Jimmy? Yes. So that was actually more like 6-8 years that they planned to buy them out. And it actually took more like 20 years to do that process. So imagine with these amounts of money in Canada, how long and expensive that process would be. And we would probably lose public support at that point. So where are we at in that equation of, we are talking about buying public support to invest in changing dairy supply management, in changing dairy market and industry, but we're asking the public to pay extra taxes for 20 plus years and unknown amounts. So we discussed this, of course, thoroughly, even shouted and argued for days, but we ended up thinking this is not really is quite uncompetitive, be asking for more money when we're already coming into this challenge because of prices are higher. That was the first question. It wasn't the framework of why we coming into this challenge. And so we decided just to let the market do its own thing.
Supply management always leads to shouting and arguments. It's just the way it is.
That is
Thank
true.
you, folks. Oh, the coach, that would be you.
Oh, okay.
Take it away,
Okay,
Luke.
so you suggest that is a bit of the question that they ask at the Competition Bureau, and that I said I would have asked if they didn't ask. So what if you change the system right away? And you're right, it would be extremely expensive. It would be you buying them out, but the system that they propose is gradual. So it's a bit like competition that you have in any other industry. I buy a plant. Tomorrow there's a guy that comes to compete with me. Well, my plant is going to suffer. I paid $200 million for the plant, but the competition is able to charge less for their price. My plant is not worth $200 million, but I don't go and complain to the government. I fight for so that's what it is. If you, of course, cut the legs of the guy who just invested or just paid for the quota, he's going to revolt. But if you do it gradually, you're saying to the industry, you're like anybody else. You got to compete, and we'll.
I love the idea of gradual. I want Shaq to answer this question. So Shaq, so when the people come, when the dairy farmers of Canada come to you and they want to hire you, are they going to be convinced that the gradual loss of their assets is okay because it's just gradual? Or are they going to, maybe they're not going to notice the gradual loss? I just,
You got to pay for that advice.
Hey, okay. We're done.